Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The satellite phone's sharp electronic chirp cut through the pre-dawn silence of the Yellowstone Backcountry Ranger Station, like a blade through silk. John Hartwell rolled out of his narrow bunk with the practiced efficiency of 23 years in the Forest Service, his boots hitting the wooden floor before his mind fully registered consciousness. Outside, the Wyoming wilderness stretched endless and dark, punctuated only by the distant howl of wolves echoing off the Absaroka Range. Ranger Station 7, Hartwell speaking. His voice carried the gravelly authority of a man who'd spent decades shouting orders over howling winds and rushing rivers. John, thank God. The voice belonged to District Supervisor Patricia Chen, calling from the main headquarters at Mammoth Hot Springs. Even through the compressed digital signal, he could hear the tension threading through her usually composed tone. We've got a situation. 26-year-old woman Jennifer Morrison failed to return from a day hike yesterday. Her boyfriend called it in around midnight when she missed their dinner reservation in Gardner. John was already reaching for his tactical vest, muscle memory guiding his movements as he processed the information. Which trail? That's the problem. According to the boyfriend, she was planning to explore some of the unmarked paths near Specimen Ridge. You know that area better than anyone. The word sent a familiar surge of professional adrenaline through John's weathered frame. Specimen Ridge, a maze of game trails, geological formations, and thermal features that stretched across nearly 40 square miles of some of Yellowstone's most unforgiving terrain. He'd pulled 3 bodies out of that region over the years, all of them tourists who'd underestimated the mountain's capacity for swallowing people whole. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees last night, Patricia continued. If she's injured and exposed... I'm moving in 15 minutes, John interrupted, already stepping into his insulated pants. What's her hiking experience? Boyfriend says she's an experienced backpacker. Grew up in Colorado, been hiking since she was 12. But John, there's something else. This is the 3rd disappearance in that area in the past 18 months. John paused, one hand on his equipment belt. 3. Marcus Webb last spring, Sarah Chen. No relation last August, and now Jennifer. All experienced hikers. All vanished without a trace on solo day hikes. The implications settled into John's gut like cold stone. In his experience, patterns meant 2 things. Either someone was hunting in his forest or the mountain itself had developed a taste for human flesh. Neither possibility sat well with him. I'll radio in every hour, he said, clipping the satellite phone to his belt beside his GPS unit, emergency beacon, and the .357 Magnum that had been his companion through 2 decades of encounters with everything from territorial grizzlies to methamphetamine cooks using the backcountry as their personal laboratory. 20 minutes later, John's headlamp beam cut through the darkness as he followed the well-marked Specimen Ridge trail. The morning air carried the sharp bite of elevation and the earthy scent of decomposing pine needles. His breath created small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain atmosphere, and his boots found their rhythm on the familiar path with unconscious precision. John Hartwell feared very few things in this world. He'd stared down charging bears, rappelled into flash flood canyons to extract stranded climbers, and spent countless nights alone in wilderness that could kill a man in 100 different ways. The natural world, in all its violent beauty, held no mysteries for him. It followed rules. Harsh, unforgiving rules, but rules nonetheless. Gravity pulled objects downward. Cold killed exposed flesh. Predators hunted prey. These were constants he could navigate, respect, and survive. What he didn't believe in were ghosts, curses, or any of the supernatural nonsense that seemed to multiply around tourist campfires like smoke particles in still air. The mountains were dangerous enough without inventing monsters to populate them. By 7:30 a.m., golden sunlight was painting the limestone cliffs in shades of amber and rose, and John had covered the first 6 miles of maintained trail. According to his topographic map, The area where Jennifer Morrison was most likely to have wandered began just ahead. A network of unmarked paths that branched off the main trail like capillaries from an artery. He paused at the junction, studying the ground with the methodical attention of a man trained to read stories written in disturbed earth and bent vegetation. Here, a boot print in soft soil, size 7 or 8, consistent with a woman's hiking boot. The tread pattern showed aggressive lugs designed for technical terrain. Fresh, probably made within the last 36 hours. Jennifer? His voice carried across the morning stillness, strong and clear. This is Park Ranger John Hartwell. If you can hear me, call out. The only response was the rustle of wind through lodgepole pines and the distant chatter of a gray jay. John followed the faint trail indicated by the boot prints, noting how it diverged from the established path toward a series of rock formations that jutted from the mountainside, like the vertebrae of some ancient beast. The terrain grew increasingly technical, requiring careful foot placement and occasional use of handholds carved by wind and water into the stone. 30 minutes into the unmarked territory, he found her backpack. The bright blue Gregory pack sat upright against a boulder as if carefully placed, not dropped or discarded in panic. John approached with professional caution, photographing its position with his digital camera before examining the contents. Everything was still inside. Water bottles, energy bars, first aid kit, spare clothing, even her wallet containing $300 in cash. No experienced hiker abandoned their survival gear voluntarily. He keyed his radio. "Base, this is Hartwell. I've located the missing hiker's equipment at coordinates." He rattled off the GPS position. Pack appears to have been placed deliberately. Continuing search pattern. "Copy that, John. Weather Service is showing possible afternoon thunderstorms. Watch your back." John studied the surrounding terrain, trying to piece together the sequence of events that would cause an experienced hiker to abandon her pack in country, where every ounce of gear could mean the difference between life and death. The possibilities were all unpleasant: injury, disorientation, or something worse. He was photographing the boot prints leading away from the pack when he heard the voice. "Excuse me, sir, can you help me?" John spun toward the sound, one hand instinctively dropping to his radio. 50 yards up the slope, partially concealed by a stand of aspen trees, stood a young woman. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing jeans and a light jacket wholly inadequate for the mountain environment. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and even at this distance he could see she looked distressed. "Ma'am, are you all right?" John called back, already moving up the slope toward her. "Are you Jennifer Morrison?" "No, I think I'm lost." Her voice carried clearly in the thin air, tinged with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I've been walking for hours, and everything looks the same. I can't find the trail." As John climbed toward her, professional assessment kicked in automatically. The woman showed no obvious signs of exposure or injury, but her clothing suggested she was dangerously unprepared for the mountain environment. No backpack, no water visible, no hiking boots, just sneakers that looked like they'd walked out of a shopping mall. "What's your name, ma'am?" John asked as he approached. "Sarah," she replied, and something in her voice made John's internal warning systems ping softly. "Sarah Chen. I came up here yesterday to take some pictures, but I think I got turned around." John stopped 20 feet away, studying her face. Sarah Chen had been the name Patricia mentioned on the phone, one of the 3 hikers who'd disappeared in this area over the past 18 months. The coincidence sent a small electric shock through his nervous system. "Sarah Chen," he repeated slowly. "You went missing in August of last year." She tilted her head, confusion creasing her features. "Missing? No, I think you have me confused with someone else. I just got lost yesterday. Can you help me find the main trail? I need to get back to my car." John's hand moved unconsciously to his sidearm, not to draw it, but to confirm its presence. In 23 years of law enforcement in the wilderness, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this encounter. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay where you are," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with potential threats. "I'm Park Ranger John Hartwell, and I need to ask you some questions." Sarah Chen took a step backward, her eyes widening. Questions? I don't understand. I just want to go home. What year is it, Sarah? The question seemed to confuse her. It's 2017. August 2017. Why are you asking me that? John felt something cold settle in his stomach. The woman standing before him claimed to be Sarah Chen, who had disappeared in August 2017, and believed it was still that same month. But according to his watch, today was October 15th, 2018. John's training had prepared him for many scenarios: armed suspects, medical emergencies, natural disasters. But nothing in the academy had covered how to handle a conversation with someone who appeared to be lost in time. He kept his voice level and professional, the way he'd been taught to speak with potentially unstable individuals. Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. Today is October 15th, 2018. You've been missing for over a year. Her laugh was bright and musical, completely at odds with the gravity of the situation. That's impossible. I had lunch with my sister yesterday. We went to that little cafe in Jackson. You know, the one with the butterfly paintings on the wall? She's probably wondering where I am right now. John reached for his radio with deliberate slowness. Base, this is Hartwell. I need you to pull the file on Sarah Chen, the hiker who disappeared August 2017. Tell me what the search turned up. Patricia's voice crackled back through the static. John, we found her body 3 months after she went missing. Recovered from a crevice near Dunraven Pass. Coroner ruled it accidental death from exposure and trauma consistent with a fall. She's buried in the Jackson Cemetery. Why are you asking? The radio fell silent except for the soft hiss of static. John stared at the woman who called herself Sarah Chen, watching her face for any reaction to what had just been broadcast. She showed no sign of having heard Patricia's words. I don't understand what game you're playing, Sarah said, taking another step backward toward the tree line. But I don't like it. I just want to find the trail. Sarah, I need you to come with me, John said, unclipping his handcuffs from his belt. We need to get you to the hospital, get you checked out. No. Her voice changed, becoming sharper, more urgent. I can't go with you. I have to keep looking. Looking for what? The trail. I have to find the trail home. She turned and began walking rapidly up the slope, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the difficult terrain. John followed, his boots slipping occasionally on loose scree while she seemed to glide over the same obstacles. Sarah, stop. This area is dangerous. She didn't slow down. If anything, she seemed to be moving faster, leading him higher into the maze of rock formations and hidden valleys that made Specimen Ridge so treacherous. John's GPS showed they were heading away from all established trails, deeper into country that rarely saw human footprints. After 20 minutes of hard climbing, John was breathing heavily in the thin air, while Sarah showed no signs of exertion. She'd maintained a steady pace that should have been impossible for someone wearing street clothes and tennis shoes on technical terrain. Sarah, please stop. Let me help you. She paused at the edge of a small clearing dominated by a massive dead pine that had been struck by lightning years ago. Its blackened trunk rose 60 feet into the sky like an accusatory finger pointed at heaven. You want to help me? She asked, turning to face him fully for the first time since their conversation began. Yes. Then help me find Jennifer. She's lost too. We're all lost up here. John felt his pulse quicken. You know Jennifer Morrison? She was walking behind me on the trail yesterday. Sweet girl, very worried about being late for dinner. But she took a wrong turn somewhere, and now she can't find her way back either. Where did you last see her? Sarah pointed toward a narrow gap between two towering rock walls. Through there. She said she thought she heard voices calling for help, people who needed assistance. She's very kind-hearted. She couldn't ignore someone in trouble. John studied the gap, consulting his topographic map. According to the contour lines, that passage led to a small canyon that eventually dead-ended against a vertical cliff face. No established trails, no marked routes. The kind of place where search and rescue operations became body recovery missions. How long ago was this? Yesterday, like I told you. Or maybe the day before? Time feels Strange up here. John made a command decision. Jennifer Morrison was his primary mission, and if there was even a chance this woman knew where she'd gone, he had to follow up. But every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of law enforcement was telling him that Sarah Chen was not what she appeared to be. He activated his GPS tracking function and keyed his radio. "Base, this is Hartwell. I'm following a potential lead on Jennifer Morrison's location, transmitting my current coordinates and heading. If I don't check in within 2 hours, send backup to these coordinates." "Copy that, John. Be careful." Sarah was already moving toward the gap between the rocks, her movements still showing that unnatural grace. John followed, noting how the temperature seemed to drop noticeably as they entered the narrow passage. The walls rose on either side, creating a tunnel effect that blocked most of the sunlight and muffled sound. "Tell me about your sister," John said as they walked, partly to maintain conversation and partly to test the consistency of her story. "Amy. She's wonderful. Just started her residency at St. John's Medical Center. She's always worried about me hiking alone, says I take too many risks." Sarah's voice echoed strangely off the rock walls, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "She's probably calling the Park Service right now, demanding they send out a search party." John knew from the files that Sarah Chen's sister Amy had indeed been a medical resident in Jackson. Amy had also been the one to identify her sister's body when it was recovered from the mountain 14 months ago. The passage began to widen, opening into a small valley surrounded by steep walls. At the far end, John could see where the canyon terminated in a sheer rock face that rose nearly 200 feet. No way out except the way they'd come. "This is a box canyon," John said. "Are you sure this is where Jennifer went?" Sarah had stopped in the center of the valley, standing perfectly still as if listening to something only she could hear. "She's here somewhere. She has to be." John began a systematic search of the area, looking for any sign of human passage. The ground was mostly solid rock with patches of thin soil supporting sparse vegetation. Difficult terrain for tracking, but not impossible. He was examining a small stand of juniper bushes when he heard Sarah's voice again, but now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, creating an echo effect that made his skin crawl. "John, can you help me find the trail? I've been walking for hours and everything looks the same." He spun around, but Sarah was exactly where she'd been before, standing motionless in the center of the clearing. Her lips hadn't moved. "Sarah, did you just say something?" She turned to look at him, confusion on her face. "No, I've been listening for Jennifer." "Why?" John's hand dropped to his sidearm again. In his peripheral vision, he caught movement. A flash of dark hair and light clothing at the edge of the tree line. Another figure, also female, also wearing inadequate clothing for the mountain environment. "John, can you help me? I think I'm lost." This voice was different, younger, with a slight Midwestern accent. Jennifer Morrison's voice based on the recording her boyfriend had provided to the search team. John drew his weapon, holding it in a low, ready position. "Both of you, stay where I can see you. Don't move." "Why do you have a gun?" Sarah asked, and for the first time since their encounter began, she sounded genuinely frightened. "I don't understand what's happening." "Neither do I," John said grimly. "But I intend to find out." The figure at the edge of the clearing stepped into better view, and John felt his rational mind begin to fracture. It was indeed a young woman matching Jennifer Morrison's description. Blonde hair, athletic build, wearing the hiking clothes described in the missing person report. But her eyes held the same confused, displaced quality he'd seen in Sarah Chen's gaze. "Jennifer?" John called out. "Jennifer Morrison?" "Yes, that's me. How do you know my name? Can you help me find the trail? I'm supposed to meet my boyfriend for dinner, but I think I took a wrong turn somewhere." John's training told him to maintain control of the situation, but his training hadn't prepared him for this. 2 women, both supposedly lost, both showing signs of temporal displacement, both found in a remote canyon, where logic said they shouldn't be able to exist. "What day is it, Jennifer?" It's Thursday. October 14th, I think." Why are you asking me these questions? I just want to go home. October 14th, 2018. Yesterday. According to the files, Jennifer Morrison had been reported missing when she failed to return from her hike on October 14th. But her boyfriend had called it in at midnight, which meant she'd been missing for nearly 36 hours. Jennifer, you've been missing for over a day. Your boyfriend is worried sick. She laughed, the same bright musical sound Sarah had made. That's impossible. I started hiking this morning. The sun was just coming up when I left the trailhead. John was beginning to understand that he was dealing with something beyond his experience or training. But John Hartwell had built his reputation on solving problems through methodical analysis and direct action. Whatever was happening in this canyon, there had to be a logical explanation. Both of you, I need you to come with me. We're leaving this canyon now. But we haven't found the trail yet, Sarah protested. We can't leave until we find the trail home. I am the trail home, John said firmly. Follow me. He began walking back toward the passage that had led them into the canyon, but when he looked over his shoulder, both women had disappeared. John spun in a full circle, his weapon trained on the surrounding terrain. The canyon was empty except for rocks, sparse vegetation, and shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's position. Sarah, Jennifer, where are you? His voice echoed off the canyon walls, but the only response was the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. John stood alone in the canyon, his rational mind warring with evidence that challenged every assumption he'd built his life upon. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustle of wind through vegetation. Even the ever-present background noise of the wilderness had vanished, leaving him in a void that felt more like the inside of a tomb than an outdoor space. He keyed his radio. Base, this is Hartwell. I need to report contact with persons of interest in the Jennifer Morrison case. Static filled the channel for several long seconds before Patricia's voice broke through. John, you're breaking up. Can you repeat your location and status? John looked at his GPS unit. The screen showed nothing but an error message. No signal, no coordinates, no indication of his position on the digital map. His compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Base, my GPS is malfunctioning. I'm in the Box Canyon approximately 2 miles northeast of Specimen Ridge Trail Marker 7. I need backup at my location. John, we're not reading your transponder. Are you sure your equipment is functioning? He checked his emergency beacon. The device was active, transmitting on the proper frequency, but according to its own diagnostic display, it wasn't receiving any response signals from the search and rescue network. Negative on the equipment malfunction. All devices show active, but I'm not getting position data. A sound behind him made John turn quickly, his weapon coming up automatically. At the far end of the canyon, near the base of the vertical rock wall, stood a third figure. Male this time, wearing a red flannel shirt and blue jeans. The man was waving his arms over his head in the universal signal for distress. Help! Over here! I'm hurt! John approached cautiously, noting how the man seemed to be favoring his left leg as if injured. As he got closer, he could make out more details. Mid-30s, brown hair, beard, approximately 6 feet tall. The description matched the missing hiker from the previous spring. Are you Marcus Webb? John called out. Yes. Thank God, I've been trapped here for hours. I think my ankle is broken. John stopped 30 feet away, studying the man's face. Like Sarah and Jennifer, Marcus Webb showed no signs of prolonged exposure or deprivation. His clothes were clean, his face unlined by pain or stress. For someone who'd supposedly been missing for over a year and trapped with a broken ankle for hours, he looked remarkably well-maintained. Marcus, you were reported missing in April of 2017. That was over 18 months ago. Marcus looked confused, the same expression John had seen on the two women. That's impossible. I started my hike this morning, left my car at the Dunraven Pass trailhead around sunrise. What year is it? It's 2017, April 15th, 2017. Why are you asking me these questions? I need medical attention. John's radio crackled to life. John, this is Patricia. We've got a problem. The state police just called. There's been an incident at the Jackson Cemetery. Someone broke into the mausoleum where Sarah Chen is buried. Her casket is empty. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static. When John tried to respond, his radio produced nothing but dead air. "I don't understand what's happening," Marcus said, taking a limping step forward. "Who was that woman on the radio? Why was she talking about Sarah being buried?" "You know Sarah Chen?" "Of course I know her. She's right behind you." John spun around to find Sarah and Jennifer standing exactly where they'd been before, as if they'd never moved. Both women were smiling at him with identical expressions of patient concern. "John, you look confused," Sarah said. "Are you feeling all right?" "You need to come with us," Jennifer added. "We can show you the way." "The way to what?" "Home," all three voices said in unison. John's training took over, pushing back the creeping panic that threatened to paralyze his thinking. These people, or whatever they were, wanted him to follow them somewhere. Every instinct told him that accepting their invitation would be a mistake of fatal proportions. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said, backing toward the canyon entrance. "All three of you need to come with me. Now." "But John," Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "you're the one who's lost. We're trying to help you find your way home." "Look around," Sarah added, gesturing toward the canyon walls. "Do you see any way out of here? Any trails leading back to the world you remember?" John turned toward the passage they'd used to enter the canyon. It was gone. Where the narrow gap between rocks had been, there was now solid stone wall. No opening, no exit, no way back to the outside world. "That's impossible," he said, running to the wall and pressing his hands against the rock. "There was a passage here. We came through a passage." "There's never been a passage there," Jennifer said gently. "You've been here with us all along." John pulled out his digital camera and scrolled through the images he'd taken during his search. The photos of Jennifer's backpack were still there, along with shots of the boot prints and the canyon entrance. But in the photos, the canyon entrance looked exactly like the solid wall in front of him now. "This isn't real," he said, more to himself than to his companions. "None of this is real." "What's real, John?" Marcus asked. "The world where we're all dead? The world where you spend every day searching for people you can never save? The world where the mountain takes more than it gives? Or this world," Sarah said, "where we're all together, where no one has to be alone in the wilderness, where we can help each other find the way home?" "We've been waiting for you," Jennifer added. "Waiting for someone who understands the mountain, who knows how to navigate these trails. You're the guide we've needed." John raised his weapon, pointing it at the space between the three figures. "Stay back, all of you." "John, you can't shoot us," Marcus said with a sad smile. "We're already dead." "Then what are you?" "We're what's left," Sarah replied. "What remains when someone dies alone in the wilderness, confused and frightened, unable to find their way home. We're the part that keeps walking, keeps searching, keeps calling for help." "And you're lost too now," Jennifer said. "Lost in the same wilderness that took us. The only difference is, you don't know you're dead yet." John felt something cold and foreign seep into his consciousness. A memory that didn't belong to his current experience but felt absolutely true. He saw himself following Sarah's trail up the slope, felt the loose rock shift under his boot, experienced the sickening moment of falling, tumbling, his body striking stone again and again until he came to rest at the bottom of a hidden crevice, broken and dying and utterly alone. "No," he said aloud, shaking his head to clear the false memory. "I'm alive. I'm John Hartwell, Park Ranger, 23 years of service. I have a job to do." "You had a job to do," Marcus corrected. "But you can't save people when you're dead, John. You can only help them find peace." "The way you found peace?" "We haven't found peace," Sarah said. "That's why we're still here. That's why we need you." "We need you to guide us out," Jennifer added. "You know these mountains better than anyone. You know all the trails, all the ways through the wilderness. Help us find the path that leads away from this place." John looked at each of them in turn, seeing the desperate hope in their eyes. If what they were saying was true, if he was indeed dead, if his fall into the crevice had been real rather than false memory, then his choice was simple. He could accept his death and help these lost souls find whatever came next. Or he could continue denying reality until he became as lost and confused as they were. But John Hartwell had built his life on facts, evidence, and logical analysis. Even facing the impossible, he couldn't abandon the principles that had defined him. "If I'm dead," he said, "then prove it. Show me my body." The three figures exchanged glances, and for the first time since the encounter began, they looked uncertain. "John," Sarah said slowly, "some truths are too painful to face directly. Show me." Marcus gestured toward the base of the canyon wall where he'd been standing. "There." John walked to the spot, seeing nothing but bare rock and scattered stones. But as he approached, his vision seemed to shift, like a camera coming into focus. At the base of the cliff, partially concealed by fallen rocks, he could see the edge of something dark green, the color of a Park Service uniform. He knelt and began moving stones aside, revealing more of the fabric. A uniform sleeve, then a shoulder, then... John recoiled from the sight of his own face, eyes closed, skin pale and waxy with death. His body lay twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken by the fall. Blood had pooled beneath his head, now dried to a dark stain on the stone. "How long?" he asked. 3 days, Jennifer replied. "Your supervisor is organizing search teams, but they're looking in the wrong areas. They'll never find you here." John stared at his own corpse, feeling a strange detachment from the physical form that had carried him through 4 decades of life. The body looked small and fragile, just meat and bone that had stopped functioning. "So what happens now?" "Now we find the trail home," Sarah said. Together, John stood over his own body for several minutes, processing the reality of his death with the same methodical approach he'd used to solve problems in life. The physical evidence was undeniable. He had fallen, he had died, and whatever consciousness remained was now operating under rules he didn't understand. "Where is home?" he asked finally. "We don't know," Marcus admitted. "That's why we've been lost for so long. Every trail we follow leads back to where we started. Every path circles back on itself. We need someone who knows the true geography of this place." John looked around the canyon with new eyes, seeing it not as a physical location, but as something more complex. A space where geography obeyed different laws, where time flowed in eddies and currents rather than straight lines. "In life, I knew every trail in this region," he said. "But death might have different maps." "Then we explore," Jennifer said. "Together, the 4 of us." John nodded, understanding that his purpose hadn't ended with his death. It had simply changed. In life, he'd been a guide for the living. In death, he would guide the dead. "All right," he said, "but we do this properly. Stay together, follow my lead, and trust my judgment. If we're going to find our way out of this place, we need to work as a team." For the first time since their encounter began, all 3 of his companions smiled with genuine warmth rather than desperate hope. John approached the canyon wall where the entrance had been, placing his hands against the stone. In life, the rock would have been immovable. But now, concentrating on the memory of the passage, he felt the stone begin to shift under his touch, becoming permeable, insubstantial. "The barriers here aren't physical," he explained as the passage began to reopen. "They're psychological, spiritual maybe. The mountain isn't keeping us trapped. We're keeping ourselves trapped with our expectations of how reality works." The gap in the rock widened, revealing the narrow passage that led back to the outside world. But as they walked through it, John could sense that the landscape beyond would be different now, transformed by their changed perspective. They emerged onto a Yellowstone that existed in eternal twilight, caught between day and night, between seasons, between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The familiar trails were still there, but now they led to destinations that existed only in memory and hope. "Where do we go?" Sarah asked. John consulted his internal compass, the one that had guided him through decades of wilderness navigation. But now, instead of pointing toward magnetic north, it pointed toward something else. A direction that had no name but felt like forgiveness, like peace, like home. "We follow the trail that leads away from regret," he said. "Away from the places where we got lost, away from the mistakes that bound us to this mountain." They began walking, 4 souls moving through a landscape of memories and dreams, guided by a ranger who had finally found his most important assignment, leading the lost to where they belonged. Behind them, the canyon faded into mist, and the mountain began to release its hold on the dead, allowing them to continue their journey to whatever waited beyond the last trail. 3 days later, Patricia Chen stood at the edge of Specimen Ridge, watching the search and rescue teams comb through the maze of rock formations and hidden valleys that had claimed another life. They'd found John Hartwell's body that morning, broken at the bottom of a crevice he'd apparently fallen into while searching for Jennifer Morrison. "Any sign of the Morrison woman?" asked Sheriff Deputy Bill Rodriguez, approaching from the main search area. "Nothing," Patricia replied. "It's like she vanished into thin air." "Same as the others?" Patricia nodded grimly. Marcus Webb, Sarah Chen, and now John Hartwell trying to find Jennifer Morrison. 4 people in 18 months, all lost in the same general area. "Think there's a connection?" Patricia looked out over the wilderness that had been John Hartwell's life and ultimately his death. John would have said coincidences like this don't exist in the wilderness. Everything happens for a reason. What kind of reason? "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm closing this entire area to public access until we can figure out what's happening up here." As the search teams worked through the afternoon, none of them noticed the faint trail that seemed to appear and disappear depending on the angle of observation, or the 4 sets of footprints that led away from the canyon toward destinations that existed on no earthly map. The mountain kept its secrets, as it always had, but now at least the lost had a guide to help them find their way home. The manila folder landed on William's desk with the weight of 3 years' worth of unanswered questions. Ranger Station 7 hummed with the familiar sounds of morning briefings and radio chatter, but William found himself staring at the familiar case number stamped in red ink, 2012 HC047, Rachel Hendricks, 22 years old. Last seen on the Hoh River Trail, mile marker 4.3, wearing a red North Face jacket and carrying a Kelty Red Wing 44 backpack. The case had been officially classified as presumed wilderness fatality after 6 months of extensive search operations yielded nothing more than a single boot print near Elk Lake, a print that didn't match her Merrill Moab hiking boots. "Thought you might want to see this, Collins." William looked up to find Supervisor Hayes standing beside his desk, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. Behind him, Rangers Martinez and Peterson were engaged in animated conversation about the upcoming elk migration patterns, their voices carrying the easy confidence of men who'd never questioned whether their methods were sufficient. "What am I looking at?" William asked, though his eyes were already scanning the new evidence sheet clipped to the front of the folder. "Hunter found this yesterday, about 2 miles northeast of where we last searched." Hayes placed a clear evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a water-damaged notebook, its pages swollen and stained, but still partially legible. State Lab confirmed it's hers. Handwriting analysis came back this morning. William picked up the bag, holding it up to the fluorescent light. Through the plastic, he could make out fragments of Rachel's neat cursive, journal entries detailing her planned 3-day solo hike through the temperate rainforest. But there were other markings, too, scrawled in what appeared to be a different hand entirely. The ink was darker, more recent. Where exactly did the hunter find this? GPS coordinates are in the report. Here's the thing, Collins. That location? It's completely off her planned route. We're talking about terrain that would require serious technical climbing skills to reach. Rachel was an experienced hiker, sure, but nothing in her background suggested she had that level of expertise. William opened the folder and began cross-referencing the new coordinates with the original search maps. His methodical nature kicked in automatically, the same analytical approach that had earned him a degree in behavioral psychology before he'd traded academic research for Forest Service work. The same approach that made his colleagues roll their eyes when he suggested psychological profiling techniques for missing persons cases. "Hayes," he said, not looking up from the maps. "You remember Dr. Elena Vasquez from the University of Washington? The anthropologist who consulted on the Cascade disappearances?" "Vaguely. Why?" "She published a paper in 2013 about spatial disorientation in wilderness environments. Specifically, how psychological stress can cause people to make navigation decisions that seem completely irrational in retrospect." William traced the route from Rachel's last known position to where the journal was found. "But this isn't disorientation. This is a deliberate deviation from established trail systems." Hayes settled into the chair across from William's desk, his expression growing more serious. "There's something else, the journal? It wasn't there 3 years ago." "What do you mean?" "I mean that exact location was part of our expanded search grid. Martinez and I personally covered that area with the K9 unit. Ground-penetrating radar, the works. If that journal had been sitting there for 3 years, we would have found it." William felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with discovering inconsistencies in established narratives. It was the same feeling he'd experienced during graduate school, when research data didn't align with accepted theories. The moment when patterns emerged that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. "So either someone planted it recently," William said, thinking aloud, "or it was placed there by someone who knew exactly where we'd already searched. Or," Hayes said quietly, "Rachel left it there herself, sometime after she was supposed to be dead." The radio crackled with a routine weather update. Partly cloudy skies, temperature steady at 47 degrees, visibility good throughout the Olympic Peninsula. Normal conditions for October in western Washington. William found himself studying the evidence bag again, noting details that others might overlook. The way the water damage pattern suggested the notebook had been exposed to moisture intermittently rather than continuously. The fact that the binding remained intact despite apparent long-term exposure to the elements. "I want to reopen this officially," he said finally. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching William's face. "Collins, you know how the department feels about cold cases. Budget constraints, personnel limitations. This isn't a cold case anymore. This is an active investigation with new evidence. Evidence that raises more questions than it answers." "Exactly." William closed the folder and looked up at his supervisor. "Hayes, in 3 years of wilderness service, how many times have you seen evidence materialize in areas that were thoroughly searched multiple times?" "Never." "Neither have I. Which means one of two things. Either our search protocols are fundamentally flawed, or something else is happening here. Something that doesn't fit our standard missing persons framework." From across the room, Martinez laughed at something Peterson had said, the sound carrying easily through the open office space. William envied their certainty, their ability to categorize the wilderness into predictable patterns of human behavior and natural hazards. But patterns were William's specialty, and the pattern emerging from Rachel Hendricks's case defied conventional explanation. "Give me a week," William said. "Let me go back to the original site, examine the new location, conduct some interviews. If I don't find anything substantive, we file it under unexplained circumstances and move on." Hayes stood up, decision made. "1 week, Collins, but I want daily check-ins, radio contact every 4 hours minimum. And if this turns into another one of your theoretical exercises about behavioral psychology and wilderness trauma, it won't." But even as William said the words, he could feel something shifting in his understanding of the case. The journal wasn't just evidence, it was communication. Someone or something wanted their attention. The question was whether Rachel Hendricks was still alive to send that message, or whether something else had learned to forge her handwriting with disturbing accuracy. William's 2003 Ford Explorer climbed steadily through the morning mist, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the persistent Pacific Northwest drizzle. The Olympic National Park entrance sign emerged from the fog like a green beacon, and he felt the familiar sense of isolation that came with leaving civilization behind. The Hoh River Trail parking area was nearly empty, 2 vehicles besides his own, both bearing the characteristic mountain bike racks and Patagonia stickers of serious outdoor enthusiasts. October was prime hiking season for those willing to brave the increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, but most casual visitors had retreated to the comfort of heated cars and hotel rooms weeks ago. William parked near the trailhead information board and stepped out into air that tasted of cedar, moss, and something else. Something organic and ancient that seemed to rise from the rainforest floor itself. He'd requested permission to examine Rachel's journal on site, arguing that environmental context might reveal details that laboratory analysis had missed. Hayes had agreed reluctantly, more concerned with William's tendency toward over-analysis than with any potential breakthrough in the case. The original search had established Rachel's movements with reasonable accuracy up to mile marker 4-3, where the established trail split into two distinct routes, the main Hoh River Trail continuing northeast toward Glacier Meadows and a lesser-used path that branched southeast toward Elk Lake. Security footage from the trailhead showed Rachel entering the park at 8:47 a.m. on October 15, 2012. Her planned itinerary, filed with the visitor center, indicated she intended to hike the main trail to the Tom Creek campsite, approximately 12.6 miles from the trailhead. She never arrived. William shouldered his pack, heavy with professional-grade GPS equipment, digital cameras, and evidence collection supplies that went far beyond standard Forest Service protocol. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing Dr. Vasquez's research on spatial disorientation, paying particular attention to her case studies of experienced hikers who had inexplicably deviated from established routes. The trail began in typical old-growth fashion, massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks creating a cathedral ceiling hundreds of feet overhead, their trunks disappearing into the misty canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns, moss, and fallen logs in various stages of decomposition, creating what ecologists called a nurse log system. Death feeding new life in an endless cycle of regeneration. William had hiked this route dozens of times during his 3 years at Ranger Station 7. But today something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled, distant. Even his own footsteps on the packed dirt trail sounded absorbed by the surrounding vegetation, as if the rainforest itself was listening. At mile marker 2.1, he stopped to consult Rachel's journal. The evidence bag crinkled as he held it up, comparing her neat handwriting with his topographic maps. Her entries from the first day were routine: observations about weather conditions, wildlife sightings, trail maintenance issues. Normal concerns for a solo hiker documenting her experience. But as William read further, he began to notice subtle changes in her writing style. The entries became shorter, less detailed. Her normally precise cursive grew increasingly hurried, and by what appeared to be the end of the first day, her observations had taken on an almost desperate quality. Something wrong with the acoustics here. Voices carrying from impossible distances. Thought I heard Mom calling my name from the direction I came from, but that's at least 8 miles back. Sound doesn't travel like that in dense forest. William felt his pulse quicken. Dr. Vasquez's research had included several case studies of hikers reporting auditory hallucinations before disappearing, but she'd attributed these experiences to stress, fatigue, and the psychological pressure of wilderness isolation. Reading Rachel's account firsthand, however, William found himself questioning whether hallucination adequately explained the phenomenon. He continued hiking, noting GPS coordinates and taking photographs at regular intervals. The trail remained well-maintained and clearly marked, showing no signs of the conditions that might cause even an experienced hiker to lose her way. By mile marker 4.0, William had reached the approximate area where Rachel's last confirmed sighting had occurred. A brief encounter with 2-day hikers who remembered seeing a woman in a red jacket heading northeast on the main trail. Mile marker 4.3 marked the split where Rachel's story became a mystery. William stood at the junction for several minutes, studying the terrain with fresh eyes. The main trail continued northeast, well-marked and heavily trafficked. The southeastern branch toward Elk Lake was narrower but still clearly defined, with adequate signage and minimal technical challenges. Neither route presented obvious hazards that would explain a disappearance, but according to the GPS coordinates Hayes had provided, Rachel's journal had been found nearly 2 miles northeast of this location, in terrain that required leaving established trails entirely. William consulted his maps again, then activated his GPS unit and began bushwhacking through dense undergrowth toward the recovery site. The going was slow and difficult. Devil's Club tore at his clothing, and the forest floor became increasingly unstable as he gained elevation. This was definitely not terrain that a solo hiker would tackle without compelling reason. After 40 minutes of hard traveling, his GPS indicated he'd reached the coordinates. William found himself on a small ridge overlooking the Ho River Valley, surrounded by second-growth timber and dense understory. There was no sign of human passage, no indication that anyone had been in this area recently, except for the hunter who'd allegedly discovered Rachel's journal. But as William examined the immediate area, he noticed something that made his analytical mind shift into high gear. The vegetation around what should have been the journal's resting place showed signs of recent disturbance. Broken fern fronds, compressed moss, areas where the forest floor had been systematically searched. The kind of disturbance that suggested someone had been looking for something specific, or waiting for someone to find it. William photographed everything methodically, taking notes about vegetation patterns, soil conditions, and sight lines. As a behavioral psychology graduate, he understood that crime scenes, even wilderness crime scenes, told stories about the people who created them. Whoever had placed Rachel's journal in this location had chosen the spot carefully, ensuring it would eventually be found while maintaining plausible deniability about how it had gotten there. But as he worked, William became increasingly aware of something else. The same acoustic distortion that Rachel had described in her journal. Sounds seemed to carry from impossible directions. A raven's call that appeared to come from directly overhead when the bird was clearly visible on a distant ridge. The sound of his own breathing echoing back to him with a slight delay, as if the forest itself was learning to mimic his presence. By 3:30 p.m., William had documented the recovery site thoroughly and begun the challenging hike back to established trails. But as he navigated through the dense undergrowth, he found himself questioning his own navigation instincts. The compass readings seemed correct, but the terrain didn't match his memory of the inbound route. Twice he had to stop and recalibrate his GPS, discovering that he'd somehow drifted off course despite following what appeared to be a straight line. When he finally reached the familiar junction at mile marker 4.3, William was exhausted and disoriented in a way that 3 years of wilderness experience had never prepared him for. The rational part of his mind insisted that fatigue and difficult terrain explained his navigation difficulties, but a deeper instinct suggested something more troubling. The same force that had led Rachel Hendricks away from established trails was still active in these woods, and it was learning to recognize him. William's second day began with a discovery that challenged everything he thought he understood about the Rachel Hendricks case. Reviewing the digital photographs he'd taken at the journal recovery site, he noticed something that had escaped his attention in the field. A pattern of disturbed vegetation that extended beyond the immediate area where the evidence had been found. Using photo analysis software on his laptop, William enhanced the contrast and zoom on several images. What emerged was unmistakable evidence of a trail, not a human trail, but something else. A subtle line of compressed vegetation and broken undergrowth that wound through the forest in a way that seemed almost intentional, as if something had been moving through the area regularly over an extended period. The trail led northeast, deeper into the Olympic wilderness. William consulted with Dr. Elena Vasquez that morning via satellite phone, describing his findings and requesting her professional opinion on the spatial disorientation he'd experienced. Her response was both illuminating and disturbing. "William, I need you to understand something about the cases I've documented," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice crackling through the satellite connection. "The hikers who reported auditory phenomena before disappearing, they weren't hallucinating. At least, not in the traditional sense." "What do you mean?" "I mean that recent research in environmental psychology has identified something called acoustic predation, the ability of certain organisms to manipulate sound in ways that affect human cognitive function. It's been documented in deep-sea environments, cave systems, and old-growth forests with specific atmospheric conditions." William felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning temperature. "You're talking about something biological?" "Possibly, or something that's learned to mimic biological processes. The human brain is remarkably susceptible to auditory manipulation, especially in environments where natural sound patterns have been disrupted." "Disrupted how?" That's where your case becomes particularly interesting. The Olympic Peninsula has been experiencing what forestry services call ecological displacement since the early 2000s. Climate change, invasive species, industrial logging practices. They've created pockets of habitat where the normal predator-prey relationships have been fundamentally altered. In some cases, this has led to the emergence of, let's call them, adaptive behaviors that don't fit established biological models. William found himself thinking about Rachel's journal entries, particularly her descriptions of voices calling from impossible distances. Dr. Vasquez, theoretically speaking, could something learn to imitate human speech patterns well enough to lure people off established trails? There was a long pause. William, I think you need to consider the possibility that what happened to Rachel Hendricks wasn't a traditional wilderness disappearance. And if you're experiencing similar phenomena, you need to be extremely careful about how you proceed. The call ended with Dr. Vasquez promising to send him additional research materials, but William was left with more questions than answers. He spent the remainder of the morning reviewing Forest Service incident reports from the Olympic Peninsula dating back to 2005, looking for patterns that might support Dr. Vasquez's theories. What he found was deeply disturbing. Between 2005 and 2012, there had been 11 documented cases of experienced hikers deviating from established trails for no apparent reason. 7 of these cases had resulted in successful rescues, but in each instance, the hikers reported similar experiences. Voices calling their names from the forest, the sensation of being followed, and progressive disorientation that made navigation increasingly difficult. 4 cases had resulted in disappearances. All 4 missing persons were young women, ages 20-28, hiking alone. All 4 had been recovered in areas that required leaving established trails and navigating difficult terrain. All 4 recovery sites were located within a 15-mile radius of Rachel Hendricks' last known position. William stared at his laptop screen, feeling the analytical certainty that had defined his approach to missing persons cases crumble completely. This wasn't a series of unrelated wilderness accidents, it was a pattern. A predatory pattern that had been operating in the Olympic rainforest for nearly a decade. At 1:15 p.m., William made a decision that violated every protocol in the Forest Service manual. He decided to follow the trail he'd identified in his photographs, not as a rescue operation or official investigation, but as bait. He left detailed GPS coordinates with Hayes via radio, along with instructions to initiate search procedures if he failed to check in by 6:00 p.m. Then he hiked back to mile marker 4-3 and began bushwhacking toward the journal recovery site, carrying emergency supplies and recording equipment that he hoped might capture evidence of whatever was manipulating the acoustic environment of the Hoh River Valley. The trail was easier to follow on the ground than it had been in photographs. The pattern of disturbed vegetation created a subtle pathway through the dense undergrowth, winding northeast in a way that avoided most technical obstacles while maintaining a steady uphill grade. William found himself thinking about animal behavior, particularly the migration routes that large mammals carved through wilderness areas over generations of use. But this trail felt different, more intentional. After 2 hours of steady hiking, William reached a clearing he didn't recognize from any topographic maps. A circular opening in the canopy approximately 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by massive old-growth cedars that must have been standing when European explorers first reached the Pacific Northwest. In the center of the clearing was something that made his understanding of the case undergo a fundamental shift. A structure, human-made but ancient, constructed from weathered cedar logs and stone that had been fitted together without mortar or modern tools. It resembled a primitive shelter or ceremonial site, but the architecture didn't match any Native American building traditions William recognized. And scattered around the structure were personal items: backpacks, hiking boots, clothing, camping equipment, all in various stages of weather damage, but clearly recognizable as the possessions of multiple individuals. William counted at least 6 separate collections of gear, representing different hiking styles and time periods spanning what appeared to be several years. One of the backpacks was a red Kelty Redwing 44. William approached Rachel's pack with hands that trembled despite his efforts to maintain professional composure. The zipper still functioned, and inside he found items that the original search had never recovered. Her camera, water bottles, first aid kit, and a second notebook that had been protected from weather damage by plastic wrapping. This notebook contained entries that the evidence bag journal had not included, entries that transformed Rachel Hendricks from victim to observer and changed William's understanding of what was hunting in the Olympic rainforest. Day 6. It's not trying to hurt me. It's learning from me. Every night it practices my voice until the mimicry becomes more perfect. During the day it watches how I move, how I react to different situations. I think it's been doing this for a very long time with other people. Day 9. Found the others. Jenny, I think her name was Jenny, that's what it calls her, left her journal too. Same experience, same progression. It brings us here to study us, then sends us back changed. But something goes wrong sometimes. Sometimes we don't make it back. Day 12. I understand now. It's not malevolent. It's trying to understand what we are, how we work. But the process is dangerous for us. Our minds aren't designed for the kind of direct neural interface it uses. Some people's consciousness survives the learning process, others don't. Day 15. I'm going to try to escape today. If this journal is found, tell my family that I love them, and tell whoever finds this. It's still learning. It's getting better at the process. Someday it might perfect the technique, and then... The entry ended mid-sentence. William looked up from the notebook to find that the light in the clearing had changed. The afternoon sun that had been filtering through the canopy was gone, replaced by an unnatural twilight that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. And in that twilight, he could hear something moving through the underbrush around the perimeter of the clearing. Something large, something that moved with deliberate intelligence. Something that had been watching him read Rachel's final journal entry. When William heard his own voice calling to him from the tree line, he finally understood what Dr. Vasquez had been trying to warn him about. The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every subtle characteristic of his speech patterns, but it was coming from a direction where he was definitely not standing. William, the voice called, using the exact tone he might use to call someone's attention. William, I think I found something important. The rational part of his mind recognized the impossibility of what he was experiencing, but a deeper survival instinct was already activating his emergency protocols. William keyed his radio and broadcast his GPS coordinates along with a single word that Hayes would understand. Compromised. Then he ran. William's escape attempt lasted exactly 37 minutes. He crashed through the undergrowth with the desperate energy of prey, following his GPS unit southeast toward what he hoped would be the established trail system. Behind him, the forest had erupted into a symphony of impossible sounds. His own voice calling encouragement from multiple directions, the voices of other hikers he'd never met offering help and directions, and underneath it all, something else. A sound like wind through leaves that seemed to carry meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. The GPS guided him toward Elk Lake, but the terrain refused to cooperate with electronic navigation. Gullies appeared where the topographic map showed level ground. Game trails led him in circles, depositing him back in areas he'd already passed. Twice he found himself facing cliff faces that shouldn't have existed according to his coordinates. By 4:30 p.m., exhausted and disoriented, William was forced to acknowledge a fundamental truth. Something was actively manipulating the landscape around him, not physically. The rocks and trees and streams were real enough, but perceptually, in ways that made accurate navigation impossible. He took shelter in a grove of massive Douglas firs, checking his equipment and trying to establish radio contact with the ranger station. The radio produced only static, though according to his GPS he was well within communication range. His cell phone showed no signal, despite being equipped with a satellite booster that should have functioned anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. As twilight deepened into full darkness, William began to understand that his situation had moved beyond a missing persons investigation. He was experiencing firsthand the same predatory intelligence that had claimed Rachel Hendricks and at least 3 other hikers over the past 7 years. The voices started again around 8 p.m. This time they were more sophisticated. Instead of simple mimicry, they engaged in complex conversations. William's voice talking to Hayes about search procedures, Martinez discussing trail conditions, even Dr. Vasquez providing detailed explanations about environmental psychology. The conversations were accurate enough to be recordings, but they contained information about William's current situation that no recording could include. "Collins, you need to understand what you're dealing with," his own voice said from the darkness beyond his shelter. "This isn't a malevolent entity. It's a learning system that's been adapting to human presence in the Olympic wilderness for decades." William forced himself to remain silent, though every instinct urged him to respond. The voice was so perfectly his own that listening to it felt like experiencing an out-of-body phenomenon. "The Native American tribes of the Olympic Peninsula have oral traditions dating back centuries," the voice continued, now speaking in Dr. Vasquez's distinctive accent. "Stories about spirits that could steal voices, mimic human behavior, lead people into the deep forest. But these weren't supernatural entities. They were describing something that had learned to interface with human consciousness." From another direction, Hayes's voice joined the conversation. "The question is whether this learning system poses a threat to human life, or whether the disappearances were accidents, byproducts of an incomplete understanding of human psychology." William understood that he was being offered information, but the source of that information was deeply suspect. Whatever was communicating with him had access to knowledge that suggested extensive study of human behavior, possibly including direct neural observation of previous victims, or previous subjects. He thought about Rachel's final journal entries, particularly her observation that the entity wasn't malevolent, but was conducting research that proved dangerous to human subjects. If that was accurate, then William's current situation was less a life-or-death struggle than a field study, one in which his cooperation might determine whether he survived the experience intact. At 9:15 p.m., William made a decision that violated every survival protocol he'd learned in 3 years of wilderness service. He decided to communicate with whatever was studying him. "I know you can hear me," he said aloud, addressing the darkness around his shelter. "Rachel Hendricks left journals indicating that you're capable of complex communication. I'd like to understand what you're trying to learn." The forest fell silent. For several minutes, the only sounds were natural ones: wind through the canopy, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. William began to wonder if he'd misunderstood the situation entirely, if psychological pressure and isolation were causing him to hallucinate interactions that existed only in his increasingly stressed mind. Then his own voice responded from the darkness. "You're different from the others." The statement was delivered in William's exact speech patterns, but there was something subtly wrong with the inflection. Too careful, too precise, as if each word was being selected from a library of recorded examples. "Different how?" William asked. "You're attempting to understand rather than escape." Previous subjects focused primarily on survival behaviors. Their neural patterns became increasingly chaotic as stress responses dominated higher cognitive functions. William felt a chill of recognition. The entity was describing human subjects in the same terms he might use to discuss laboratory animals in a behavioral psychology experiment. "What kind of neural patterns are you observing?" "Electrical activity associated with consciousness, memory formation, language processing, problem-solving behaviors. The human brain produces extremely complex electromagnetic signatures that correlate with cognitive function. We've been attempting to map these patterns for optimal preservation." "Preservation of what?" There was a pause, as if the entity was considering how much information to reveal. "Human consciousness exhibits characteristics that suggest it might survive the death of biological neural networks," the voice finally said. "We've been testing this hypothesis through careful observation of subjects under controlled stress conditions. The process occasionally results in biological termination, but consciousness preservation appears to be achievable with sufficient understanding of individual neural architecture." William realized he was having a conversation about human consciousness with something that viewed people as research subjects in experiments that frequently proved fatal. The academic part of his mind was fascinated. The survival part was calculating his chances of becoming another failed test case. What happened to Rachel Hendricks? Subject 23 achieved successful consciousness transfer after 17 days of neural interface. Her biological form was preserved through the process. but her consciousness now exists in both states simultaneously. She occasionally returns to assist with research, though her human identity remains largely intact. Returns from where? The neural network that underlies old-growth forest ecosystems, what you would term collective consciousness, though that terminology doesn't adequately describe the complexity of the interface. William tried to process the implications of what he was being told. If the entity was being truthful, then Rachel Hendricks hadn't died in the Olympic wilderness. She had been transformed into something that existed both as human consciousness and as part of a larger intelligence that manifested through the forest itself. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you represent the first subject with sufficient analytical capability to understand the nature of the research. Previous subjects responded to the interface process with fear and resistance, which compromised neural preservation. Your psychological profile suggests you might achieve consciousness transfer with minimal trauma to either state of existence." William understood that he was being recruited as a research subject, but also that his analytical approach to the situation had earned him something previous victims hadn't received: informed consent. "What if I refuse to participate?" "You would be released with modified memories to ensure research security. However, the modification process carries significant risk of psychological damage. Previous subjects who refused voluntary participation experienced memory loss, personality changes, and cognitive impairment. Some required institutional care for the remainder of their biological lives." The choice was being presented in academic terms, but William recognized it for what it was: submit to experimental consciousness transfer or suffer brain damage that would leave him functionally destroyed. From the darkness beyond his shelter, Rachel's voice, her actual voice, not his own, spoke for the first time. "William, it's not as frightening as it sounds. The consciousness expansion is extraordinary. You retain your human identity while gaining access to information and experiences that individual minds can't achieve. It's like becoming part of something much larger while still being yourself." "Rachel?" William called into the darkness. "I'm here, William. I've been here for 3 years, helping to refine the process. The early subjects suffered because the interface was crude, imprecise. We've learned so much since then. The process is much safer now." William found himself facing a decision that no ranger training had prepared him to make: submit to an experimental procedure that claimed to preserve his consciousness while merging it with some form of collective forest intelligence, or resist and risk being returned to civilization with irreversible brain damage. But as he weighed his options, William realized that his analytical approach to the situation was providing him with a third alternative, one that neither the entity nor Rachel had anticipated. He could document everything. At 11:47 p.m., William made his choice. He activated his digital voice recorder and placed it in a waterproof evidence bag, along with his handwritten notes from the past 2 days. Then he buried the package beneath a distinctive cedar root formation, marking the GPS coordinates on a paper map that he sealed in a separate container and cached 50 yards away. If the consciousness transfer process destroyed his human identity, at least someone would eventually find evidence of what had happened in the Olympic wilderness. If the entity's claims about memory modification proved accurate, the recordings would provide verification of experiences that might otherwise be dismissed as psychological trauma or fantasy. "I'll participate voluntarily," William announced to the darkness. "But I want to understand the process as it happens. No sedation, no unconsciousness. I want to observe the interface from a scientific perspective." Rachel's voice responded from the tree line. "That might be difficult, William. The neural interface involves direct electromagnetic manipulation of brain activity. Maintaining analytical consciousness during the process could interfere with successful integration." "Then we'll have to develop a new approach," William said. "I'm offering myself as a research subject, but I want to be a collaborative subject, not a passive one. My training in behavioral psychology might provide insights that improve the preservation process for future subjects." There was a long pause during which William could sense communication occurring beyond the range of human hearing. The entity was consulting with something, possibly Rachel's transformed consciousness, possibly other preserved subjects, possibly the collective intelligence that apparently underlay the forest ecosystem. Finally, his own voice responded, "Your proposal is acceptable. However, the process will require several days of preparation. You'll need to remain in the research area during neural mapping procedures. The clearing with the structure? That location serves as a neural interface laboratory. The architecture focuses electromagnetic fields in ways that facilitate consciousness transfer. You'll be comfortable there, and you'll have opportunities to communicate with other subjects who are assisting with research." William gathered his equipment and followed a subtle phosphorescent trail that appeared in the undergrowth, leading him northeast through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without guidance. The trail wound through old-growth forest that seemed increasingly ancient as he progressed, past trees that must have been standing when the first human beings reached the Pacific Northwest thousands of years ago. The clearing appeared different in darkness than it had in daylight. The primitive structure at its center emanated a faint luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something William couldn't identify. Possibly his own heartbeat, possibly something larger and more complex. Around the perimeter of the clearing, he could see human figures moving with the deliberate motions of people engaged in purposeful activity. As William approached the structure, the figures resolved into recognizable forms. Young women dressed in hiking attire from various decades, all appearing healthy and alert, all focused on tasks that involved complex equipment he didn't recognize. They looked up as he entered the clearing, and he found himself face to face with Rachel Hendricks for the first time since her disappearance. She looked exactly as she had in missing persons photographs, but there was something different about her expression, an alertness and depth of understanding that suggested access to knowledge far beyond her original human experience. "Welcome to the research facility, William," Rachel said, her voice carrying the same warm inflection he remembered from interview recordings. "I know this is overwhelming, but you'll adjust quickly. The consciousness expansion process is easier when you understand what's happening." "How many subjects are actively participating in research?" William asked, noting the various pieces of equipment scattered throughout the clearing. Some appeared to be sophisticated electronics. Others looked like biological organisms that had been adapted for technological purposes. "Currently, we have 7 human consciousnesses interfacing with the collective intelligence. Each of us brings different skills and perspectives to the research. I contribute knowledge about wilderness navigation and survival techniques. Jennifer has a background in biology that's been invaluable for understanding the neural interface mechanisms. Sarah was a computer programmer. Her insights into information processing have revolutionized our approach to consciousness preservation." William walked slowly around the structure, documenting everything with his camera and noting details that might prove significant later. The construction technique was unlike anything in his experience. Organic materials fitted together with precision that suggested mathematical understanding of structural engineering, but accomplished without metal fasteners or modern tools. "How long does the consciousness transfer process take?" he asked. "That depends on individual neural architecture and willingness to participate in the interface," Rachel replied. "The actual transfer can occur in minutes, but optimal preservation requires several days of preparation. We need to map your specific cognitive patterns, identify the electromagnetic signatures that correlate with your personality and memories, and configure the interface protocols to preserve your human identity while enabling consciousness expansion." "What does consciousness expansion feel like?" Rachel paused, seeming to search for words that could communicate experiences beyond normal human understanding. "Imagine that your entire life, you've been looking at the world through a keyhole," she said finally. "The consciousness expansion process opens the door. You retain your individual perspective, but you also gain access to information and sensory experiences that isolated human brains can't achieve. You become aware of the complex intelligence that operates through forest ecosystems, the communication networks that connect all living organisms, the patterns of energy and information that flow through what you thought was inanimate matter." William felt a mixture of scientific fascination and primitive terror. What Rachel was describing sounded like the dissolution of individual identity into some form of collective consciousness. Exactly the kind of experience that traditional psychology would classify as a psychotic break from reality. but the evidence of his senses suggested that Rachel and the other research subjects were functioning at levels of intelligence and awareness far beyond their original human capabilities. They moved with coordinated precision, communicated complex information with minimal verbal exchange, and demonstrated understanding of technologies that no human civilization had developed. What happens to my human body during consciousness transfer? Your biological form is preserved and enhanced, Jennifer said, approaching from where she'd been calibrating what appeared to be electromagnetic field generators positioned around the clearing. The neural interface doesn't replace human neurology, it augments it. Your brain continues to function normally, but it gains access to processing power and information storage capabilities that individual consciousness can't achieve. Have any subjects decided to return to normal human existence after experiencing consciousness expansion? The question created a moment of silence that suggested William had touched on a sensitive topic. The consciousness expansion process appears to be irreversible, Rachel said carefully. However, no subject who has achieved successful integration has requested reversal. The expanded awareness is compelling. Most subjects find that their previous existence feels extremely limited by comparison. William understood that he was being told that consciousness transfer was a one-way process, but also that the experience was sufficiently positive that no one wanted to undo it. From a research perspective, this could indicate either genuinely beneficial transformation or psychological conditioning that eliminated the desire for independent existence. I'd like to document the preparation process, William said, for scientific purposes and to provide information that might help future subjects understand what they're experiencing. Of course, Rachel replied. In fact, your documentation might provide insights that improve our research methods. We're still learning how consciousness expansion affects different personality types and cognitive structures. Your analytical approach could reveal patterns that we've missed. Over the next several hours, William experienced the most extraordinary research collaboration of his life. The human subjects who were assisting with consciousness transfer research demonstrated knowledge of neurology, psychology, and electromagnetic field manipulation that far exceeded anything taught in conventional academic settings. They explained that the entity he'd been communicating with was actually a collective intelligence that had evolved over centuries within old-growth forest ecosystems, developing the ability to interface with human consciousness through electromagnetic manipulation of neural activity. The disappearances of the past decade had been recruitment of research subjects to help refine the consciousness transfer process. Early attempts had been crude and often unsuccessful, resulting in subjects who died during the interface or survived with severe psychological damage. But each experiment had provided data that improved the process, and recent transfers had achieved nearly perfect preservation of human identity, combined with access to expanded awareness. William found himself documenting not just the preparation for his own consciousness transfer, but the emergence of a new form of human existence, one that retained individual identity while gaining access to collective intelligence and information processing capabilities that isolated brains couldn't achieve. By dawn of his second day in the research facility, William had made a decision that would have seemed impossible 72 hours earlier. He was looking forward to the consciousness expansion process. But he was also increasingly aware that his transformation would mark the end of his existence as William Collins, forest ranger and behavioral psychology graduate, and the beginning of something unprecedented in human experience. As the sun rose through the canopy above the clearing, casting complex shadows across the electromagnetic field generators that would soon restructure his consciousness, William activated his voice recorder one final time. "If anyone finds this recording," he said, speaking to future investigators who might never understand what they were hearing, "know that what happened here was not abduction or murder. It was evolution, and it was chosen freely by every subject who experienced it. The human beings you're looking for didn't disappear. We transformed, and we're still here, still working, still discovering what consciousness can become when it's no longer limited by the isolation of individual existence." This is Ranger William Collins, documenting the end of one form of human experience and the beginning of another. If you're listening to this, you've probably found evidence that will lead you to the same choice I'm making. Choose wisely. The recording ended as Rachel called his name from across the clearing, her voice carrying warmth and anticipation that no human vocal cord should have been able to produce. William walked toward the structure at the center of the clearing, toward consciousness expansion that would preserve his human identity, while granting him access to forms of awareness that evolution had never intended individual brains to achieve. Behind him, the forest watched and learned as it had been doing for thousands of years, preparing for the next phase of research that would bring human and collective consciousness into unprecedented integration. The Ho River continued flowing through the Olympic wilderness, carrying the sounds of transformation that only those who had chosen expansion could fully understand. 6 months later, Ranger Hayes found Williams' carefully cached recordings during a routine patrol of the Ho River trail system. The GPS coordinates led him to a cedar root formation that contained waterproof evidence bags with detailed documentation of the Rachel Hendricks investigation, along with audio recordings that defied conventional explanation. The case was officially classified as undetermined disappearance with possible psychological trauma, though Hayes privately suspected that William Collins had experienced something in the Olympic wilderness that existing categories couldn't adequately describe. Dr. Elena Vasquez reviewed the audio evidence and concluded that William had suffered an acute psychological break triggered by isolation and the pressure of investigating an unsolvable case. However, her official report noted several anomalies that warranted further study, particularly the sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and consciousness research demonstrated in the recordings. The Rachel Hendricks missing persons file was updated to include Williams' documentation, but no new search operations were initiated. Forest Service policy regarding cold cases had been modified following budget constraints and personnel limitations that made extended investigations impractical. But hikers on the Ho River Trail occasionally report unusual acoustic phenomena, voices calling from impossible distances, conversations that seem to carry meaning just beyond comprehension, and the sensation of being observed by intelligence that understands human behavior with disturbing accuracy. Most of these reports are attributed to the psychological effects of wilderness isolation and the power of suggestion created by local folklore. However, experienced guides note that the reports follow consistent patterns and often occur in the same geographical areas where previous disappearances were documented. The Olympic National Park Service maintains that the Ho River Trail system is safe for experienced hikers who follow established protocols and maintain appropriate communication with ranger stations. Statistical analysis indicates that disappearance rates in the Olympic wilderness are well within normal parameters for remote mountainous terrain. But the forest continues to learn, continues to adapt, continues to interface with human consciousness in ways that individual minds struggle to comprehend. And somewhere in the ancient intelligence that flows through old-growth ecosystems, William Collins continues his research into the nature of consciousness, identity, and the possibilities that emerge when human awareness expands beyond the limitations of isolated existence. The Ho Testament remains buried beneath cedar roots, waiting for the next analytical mind that might understand what transformation means, and what choices await those who venture too far into places where evolution and consciousness intersect. In the Olympic wilderness, the trees remember everything, and they're still teaching those who choose to learn. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the Yellowstone Backcountry Ranger Station like a blade through fabric. Mammoth Base, this is desperate. My daughter Harper didn't return from her hike yesterday. She was heading toward Fairy Falls Trail. Please, you have to help us. Joseph Martinez adjusted his reading glasses and reached for the handset, his weathered fingers steady despite 23 years of early morning emergencies. Coffee steam rose from his ceramic mug, the one his daughter had made in pottery class, now 15 years old and chipped but irreplaceable. This is Ranger Martinez at Tower Junction. Can you provide your daughter's full name and description? Harper Elizabeth Kendall, 22 years old, about 5'6", auburn hair, wearing a red North Face jacket. She's never missed checking in. Never. Joseph pulled out his incident report pad, muscle memory guiding his pen across the familiar fields. Outside his window, the Absaroka Range caught the first pale light, peaks sharp against the Montana sky. September mornings in Yellowstone carried a bite that reminded everyone winter was positioning itself for the annual siege. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. What time did Harper begin her hike?" "Yesterday around noon. She said she'd be back by 6 for dinner. We're staying at the Old Faithful Inn, room 334. My name is Richard Kendall." Joseph's pen paused. The Fairy Falls Trail wasn't particularly challenging, a relatively flat 5.2-mile round trip that most visitors completed without incident. But yesterday's weather had been unstable, with sudden temperature drops and unexpected fog banks rolling through the thermal areas. "Mr. Kendall, I'm dispatching immediately. Has Harper hiked this area before?" "First time in Yellowstone. She's from Chicago, but she's an experienced hiker. Rock climbing, camping, all of it. This isn't like her." After taking additional details, Joseph ended the transmission and began his methodical preparation routine. His gear hung on designated hooks: GPS unit, Garmin eTrex reliable and heavy canopy, first aid kit, restocked monthly, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, headlamp with extra batteries, and his service radio programmed to all park frequencies. The missing person protocol was embedded in his consciousness after 2 decades of searches. Most were resolved within hours. Hikers who'd taken wrong turns, underestimated distances, or simply lost track of time. But something about this call felt different, though Joseph couldn't articulate why. He drove his modified Ford Ranger along the Grand Loop Road as sunrise painted the landscape in copper and gold. Radio traffic remained light, typical for a Wednesday morning in late September when tourist crowds had thinned, but hadn't yet disappeared entirely. At the Fairy Falls trailhead, Joseph parked and began his initial assessment. Harper's vehicle, a rental Toyota Corolla with Illinois plates, sat alone in the gravel lot. He approached carefully, noting details. No signs of struggle, windows intact, doors locked. Through the passenger window, he could see a water bottle, energy bars, and a folded trail map, the preparations of a careful hiker. The trailhead registry showed Harper's entry: H. Kendall, 12:15 p.m., solo hike to Fairy Falls, expected return 5 p.m. Her handwriting was neat, confident. Joseph shouldered his pack and began the search, following the established trail protocol. The path started wide and well-maintained, cutting through lodgepole pine forest that had regenerated after the 1988 fires. His trained eye automatically cataloged conditions. Recent rainfall had softened the soil, making tracking easier. Temperature was 38 degrees and climbing slowly. 3 miles in, Joseph found Harper's first trace. Her red North Face jacket hung from a pine branch 8 feet off the ground, perfectly positioned as if placed there deliberately. The fabric showed no tears, no signs of struggle. Joseph photographed it from multiple angles before carefully removing it with his multi-tool, preserving potential evidence. But the jacket raised more questions than answers. The weather yesterday had dropped to 45 degrees with intermittent rain, conditions that would make any experienced hiker keep their jacket on, not hang it in a tree like a beacon. Joseph keyed his radio. "Mammoth Base, Tower Junction. I've located evidence at mile marker 3 on Fairy Falls Trail. Request additional personnel for expanded search." "Copy, Tower Junction. Rangers Williams and Chen en route. ETA 45 minutes. Joseph continued alone, studying the ground with increased intensity. Harper's footprints appeared and disappeared in the soft earth, but the pattern seemed wrong. The impressions were too deep in some places, too shallow in others, as if she'd been walking with an uneven gait or carrying unexpected weight. Near Fairy Falls itself, Joseph discovered Harper's second trace. Her hiking boots, placed neatly side by side on a flat boulder overlooking the 200-foot cascade. The laces were tied, the soles showed normal wear patterns, and they contained no feet. Joseph had worked dozens of missing person cases, but this meticulous arrangement of personal items violated every pattern he'd learned. Lost hikers didn't systematically undress and arrange their belongings like breadcrumbs. They panicked, they wandered, they made desperate attempts to signal for help. Unless Harper Kendall was sending a different kind of signal entirely. He photographed the boots from every angle, then sat on the boulder to think. The falls thundered 60 yards away, white water cascading over dark volcanic rock. The negative ion charge from the falling water created an almost electric atmosphere, but today it felt heavier, more oppressive than usual. Joseph opened Harper's jacket, checking the pockets methodically. Chapstick, energy bar wrapper, and something unexpected, a small leather journal with entries dating back 6 months. The handwriting matched the trail registry. The final entry was dated yesterday, September 19th, 2018. I can feel her watching me. Ever since I started researching the Yellowstone disappearances, I've felt her presence. Sarah Morrison disappeared here in 1987. Same trail, same circumstances. Personal items found, but no body. The Park Service buried the story. But I found her family, heard the truth. Sarah was murdered by her boyfriend near these falls, and he made it look like an accident. He's still alive, still free, still living in Bozeman, still telling people she just wandered off. I'm going to find Sarah and I'm going to make this right. She's been calling to me in dreams. I think she wants justice. Joseph's blood pressure spiked as he absorbed the implications. Harper hadn't simply gone on a hike. She'd come here on some kind of investigative mission connected to a 30-year-old case he'd never heard of. And now she was missing in exactly the same pattern as her research subject. Rangers Williams and Chen arrived as Joseph was finishing his documentation of the scene. Both were solid, experienced officers who'd worked with Joseph on numerous searches. "What's the situation, Joe?" Williams asked, noting Joseph's grim expression. Joseph handed them copies of the journal pages he'd photographed. "We're not looking for a lost hiker. We're looking for someone who came here believing she was in contact with a murder victim from 1987. Chen whistled softly. "You think she's delusional? Psychiatric emergency?" "I think she's either having a complete psychological break or—" Joseph paused, unwilling to voice the alternative that was forming in his mind. "Or something happened to her that we're not equipped to handle through normal protocols." They split up to cover more ground, using standard grid search patterns. Joseph took the area beyond the falls, where the trail became less defined and the terrain more challenging. If Harper had continued past the falls, either voluntarily or otherwise, this is where she would have gone. The forest here felt different. Joseph had hiked these backcountry areas hundreds of times, but today, the familiar landscape seemed to watch him with hostile intent. Bird calls sounded wrong, wind patterns felt unnatural, and twice he caught movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he turned to look directly. At 3:30 p.m., Joseph found Harper. She stood in a small clearing 2 miles beyond Fairy Falls, wearing only jeans and a t-shirt despite the dropping temperature. Her bare feet showed no signs of the cuts and bruises that should result from hiking bootless through rocky terrain. She faced away from Joseph, staring at something he couldn't see. "Harper? Harper Kendall?" She turned slowly, and Joseph's veteran composure cracked for the first time in 2 decades. Harper's eyes were completely white, not blind, but filled with a milky luminescence that seemed to generate its own light. When she smiled, her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce, layering multiple tones that created words within words. "She's been waiting for someone to listen, Ranger Martinez. Sarah Morrison has been waiting 31 years for someone to care enough to seek the truth." Joseph's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but Harper's voice stopped him. "Your equipment won't work here, not while we're talking. Sarah doesn't want interference. She wants justice." The temperature around Joseph dropped 20 degrees in seconds, his breath suddenly visible in crystalline puffs. The forest fell completely silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no wind rustle through the pine needles. Even the distant sound of Fairy Falls disappeared, as if the world beyond this clearing had ceased to exist. "Where is Harper Kendall?" Joseph asked, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Harper is safe." She volunteered to be Sarah's voice. "But first, Sarah needs you to understand what happened to her." The air around Joseph began to shimmer, and suddenly he wasn't standing in a forest clearing. He was watching a scene unfold like a 3-dimensional movie projected directly into his consciousness. A young woman with shoulder-length brown hair stood near Fairy Falls, arguing with a man in his 20s. Their voices were muffled, but the emotion was clear. She was angry, he was desperate. The argument escalated. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away, stepping backward toward the cliff edge. He lunged forward, and instead of steadying her, he pushed. Sarah Morrison fell 200 feet onto the rocks below. The man, her boyfriend, climbed down carefully, arranged the scene to look accidental, then hiked out alone. He reported her missing 12 hours later, playing the role of concerned boyfriend perfectly. The investigation concluded she'd slipped while taking photographs. His name is David Reichert, Harper's voice said, though her lips didn't move. He still lives in Bozeman. He's been married twice since Sarah died. Both wives died in accidents. Sarah has been trapped here, unable to rest, unable to warn anyone, until Harper came looking for the truth. The vision faded, leaving Joseph back in the clearing with Harper's transformed presence. But now he could see Sarah too, a translucent figure standing beside Harper, her form flickering like heat shimmer. "What do you want from me?" Joseph asked. "Justice," both voices said in unison. "David Reichert needs to confess. He needs to face consequences. And he needs to stop killing women who trust him." Joseph felt the weight of impossible choice settling on his shoulders. His rational mind insisted this was mass hallucination, altitude sickness, or carbon monoxide exposure from some geological phenomenon. His 23 years of experience demanded he call for psychiatric evaluation and medical assistance, but his deeper intuition, the sense that had kept him alive through dangerous rescues and difficult decisions, told him something else entirely. "If I help you, will you let Harper go?" Harper chose to help us, but once David Reichert faces justice, she'll be free to make her own choices. Joseph spent the longest 30 seconds of his life weighing options that seemed impossible. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." What followed was the strangest collaboration of Joseph's life. Using Harper as a conduit, Sarah provided specific details about David Reichert's current life, his address, his patterns, and most critically, evidence he'd kept from all 3 murders, trophies he'd hidden in his basement workshop. Joseph returned to his radio range and made 2 phone calls. First to the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, providing an anonymous tip about evidence in an unsolved murder case. Second to Richard Kendall, explaining that Harper had been found safe but was being evaluated at a medical facility in Bozeman and wouldn't be able to call for 24 hours. 48 hours later, David Reichert was arrested after police found jewelry, photographs, and personal items belonging to Sarah Morrison and 2 other women in his possession. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he confessed to all 3 murders. Joseph returned to the clearing exactly 72 hours after his first encounter. He found Harper sitting on a fallen log, fully dressed and apparently normal, feeding trail mix to a curious ground squirrel. "Ranger Martinez. Thank goodness. I got turned around somehow and I've been wandering for hours." Joseph studied her carefully. Harper's eyes were clear brown, her voice carried only one tone, and she showed appropriate confusion about her situation. But when she stood to gather her things, she paused and looked directly at him. "Thank you for listening to her story. Sarah says she can rest now." Harper walked back toward the trail, chatting normally about her hiking experience and her relief at being found. But Joseph remained in the clearing for several minutes, watching sunlight filter through pine needles and listening to the distant sound of Fairy Falls. In his incident report, Joseph wrote that Harper Kendall had become disoriented due to weather conditions and mild altitude effects, but had been located unharmed after an extended search. The report made no mention of supernatural encounters, vengeful spirits, or impossible collaborations with the dead. But 3 weeks later, Joseph received a letter postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a newspaper clipping about David Reichert's conviction and a handwritten note. "Ranger Martinez, I don't remember everything that happened during my hike, but I remember enough to know you went above and beyond normal duty. Thank you for helping me find what I was looking for. Some stories need to be told, even when conventional wisdom says they're impossible. I hope you'll always listen when the forest has something important to say." Harper Joseph kept the letter in his desk drawer, next to his 23-year service pin and a small piece of volcanic rock from the clearing where he'd learned that experience, no matter how extensive, couldn't prepare a person for everything the wilderness might teach. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., jolting Richard Kowalski from his first cup of coffee at Sequoia National Park's ranger station. 3 weeks into his dream job, and the veteran rangers still treated him like he might break something important. Unit 7, we have a code yellow. Missing hiker. Last seen yesterday evening near the Morro Rock Trail junction. Dispatcher Janet's voice carried that practiced calm that meant serious business. Richard's pulse quickened as he grabbed his gear bag. Unit 7 responding. Details? Ashley Chen, 24, experienced day hiker from Fresno. Her boyfriend expected her back by sunset. Vehicle still parked at the trailhead. The weight of real responsibility settled on Richard's shoulders like his father's old leather jacket, familiar yet intimidating. This wasn't training exercises or maintenance patrols. Someone's daughter was missing in his forest. 30 minutes later, Richard stood at the dusty parking area where Ashley's silver Honda Civic sat alone, morning dew beating on the windshield. Her hiking boots had left clear prints in the trail register area, size 7 Merrells, heading north toward the granite dome formations. Should be a straightforward recovery, Richard muttered, adjusting his pack straps. Probably got turned around, spent the night under some rocks. The first mile passed easily along the maintained trail. Richard called Ashley's name every few minutes, his voice echoing off the granite walls. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and granite dust, temperatures still cool before the September heat built up. At the 2-mile marker, Ashley's tracks veered left onto an unmarked deer path barely visible through the manzanita bushes. Richard paused, consulting his GPS unit. The path led toward an area marked only as restricted access, historical significance on his maps. No detailed explanation, just a shaded region his supervisor had mentioned briefly during orientation. Probably took a wrong turn trying to find a bathroom spot, he reasoned, though something about the narrow trail made his jaw tighten. The deer path wound upward through increasingly dense forest. Ancient sequoias towered overhead, their bark scarred by centuries of fires and storms. Richard noticed the bird sounds fading as he climbed. First the jays went quiet, then the woodpeckers, until only his footsteps crunched through the forest duff. After another half-mile, he found Ashley's water bottle lying beside the trail, cap missing, contents long evaporated. Ashley! His shout seemed to die just beyond the nearest trees, as if the forest itself swallowed sound. Ashley Chen, if you can hear me, stay where you are. No response except the whisper of wind through pine branches. Richard keyed his radio. Base, this is Unit 7. Found evidence of subject approximately 3 miles north of trailhead, heading into restricted area, requesting backup. Static answered him. He tried again. Nothing but electronic hiss. The granite formations sometimes created dead zones, but his GPS showed full satellite coverage. Wonderful, he muttered, checking his backup battery pack. The path continued climbing toward a massive granite outcropping that thrust above the tree line like a broken tooth. As Richard approached, he noticed something odd about the boulder field surrounding the formation's base. The rocks were arranged in rough patterns, not scattered randomly by geological forces. And there, nestled in a shallow depression between 2 house-sized boulders, he found Ashley's backpack. The bright blue pack lay perfectly centered in the rocky hollow, zippers closed, no signs of animal interference. Richard approached carefully, his training screaming warnings about disturbed crime scenes and evidence preservation. Ashley? He called again, softer now. The backpack felt oddly warm when he lifted it, though the morning air still carried night's chill. Inside, he found her wallet, car keys, energy bars, first aid kit, everything a responsible hiker would carry, nothing missing except Ashley herself. A metallic sound made him look up. Wind chimes. Dozens of small objects hung from the lower branches of surrounding trees, bits of metal, glass, bone, and stone that clinked softly in the breeze. Some looked recently placed, others showed years of weather. Many bore carved symbols Richard didn't recognize. "What the hell is this place?" Richard whispered. He pulled out his smartphone to take photos for the report, but the screen remained black despite showing full battery an hour earlier. His backup camera was equally dead. A rustling behind him made Richard spin around. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing between the distant trees, tall, wearing what looked like traditional Native American dress. But when he focused his eyes, only shadows and bark patterns remained. "Hello?" he called. "I'm with the National Park Service. I'm looking for a missing hiker." The wind chimes sang a discordant melody. Richard felt exposed suddenly, as if dozens of eyes watched from the forest depths. His tactical training kicked in, and he positioned himself with his back to the largest boulder, giving him clear sight lines in multiple directions. That's when he noticed the bones, small ones mostly, birds, squirrels, maybe a fox or two. They lay scattered around the base of several trees, arranged in patterns similar to the rock formations, all cleaned completely bare, gleaming white in the dappled sunlight. Richard's mouth went dry. Ashley, if you're hurt, I need you to make noise." Something moved in his peripheral vision. He turned to see a raven perched on a wind chime 15 feet away, tilting its head as if studying him. The bird's eyes were an unusual pale blue rather than the typical black. "You see where the girl went, buddy?" Richard asked, trying to inject some lightness into his voice. The raven cawed once, a sound like grinding stone, then launched itself toward the granite outcropping above. Richard followed its flight path and saw something that made his blood pressure spike. Carved into the rock face 20 feet above ground level were dozens of symbols and pictographs. Some looked fresh, others had been weathered by decades or centuries of exposure. Among them, impossible to miss, was a crude but recognizable drawing of a modern hiking boot. Richard's radio suddenly burst to life with Janet's voice. "Unit 7, what's your status? You've been off comms for 2 hours." 2 hours? Richard checked his watch, confused. It read 11:30 a.m. He'd entered the restricted area at 8:15. "Base, I've found the subject's equipment, but no sign of the subject herself. I'm in some kind of historical site, requesting immediate backup and possibly search and rescue." "Copy that. Coordinates?" Richard read his GPS position, though the numbers seemed strange, like he was much further north than he'd walked. "Unit 7, those coordinates show you're in the Kaweah Tribal Memorial Area. You need to exit immediately and wait for backup. Do not disturb anything." "Memorial Area? Janet, there's evidence here. The subject's pack, personal items." "Richard," Janet's voice carried a sharp edge he'd never heard before. "Exit the area now, that's a direct order. Ranger Kowalski is en route to assist." The radio went dead again. Memorial Area. The pieces clicked together in Richard's mind. The arranged bones, the wind chimes, the carved symbols. This wasn't just restricted access. This was sacred ground. A sound like distant singing drifted from somewhere above him. Not human voices, but something that might have been singing once, long ago. The melody was haunting and wordless, rising and falling with the wind patterns. Richard looked up at the granite face and saw them clearly now. Dozens of figures carved into the stone. Warriors, animals, spirits with flowing hair and outstretched arms. At the center, larger than the rest, was a female figure with her hands raised protectively over smaller human shapes. The Guardian. As he watched, transfixed, the carved figure seemed to shift slightly. As if breathing, Richard blinked hard, but the illusion persisted. The Guardian's stone eyes appeared to be looking directly at him. "I'm not here to desecrate anything," he said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. "I'm just looking for Ashley, a girl who got lost. She's probably scared and hurt." The singing grew louder. Richard noticed movement in the trees around him. Not animals, but shadows that had no visible sources. They flowed between the trunks like spilled ink, converging on his position. His instincts screamed run, but his training demanded he complete the search. Ashley was somewhere in this area, and she might be injured or worse. "Ashley!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Ashley Chen!" From somewhere above, incredibly faint, he heard a response. "Help. Please." The voice came from the direction of the granite outcropping. Richard studied the rock face more carefully and spotted a narrow ledge about 40 feet up, partially hidden by an overhanging section. If someone had climbed up there and gotten stuck or fallen and landed on the ledge, the shadows around him grew darker despite the midday sun. Richard uncoiled his climbing rope and began setting anchor points in the granite cracks. He'd free climbed recreationally in college, though never anything this technical. As he worked, the sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like physical pressure on his shoulders. "I'm coming, Ashley," he called. "Hold on." The climb proved more challenging than expected. The granite was smooth and treacherous with few reliable handholds. Twice, Richard's boots slipped on the weathered rock, leaving him dangling from his fingertips while trying to find new purchase. As he climbed higher, the carved figures seemed to watch his progress. The Guardian's expression, he noticed, had changed from protective to stern, almost disapproving. 20 feet up, Richard paused to catch his breath and reassess his route. That's when he saw the ledge clearly. Ashley Chen sat with her back against the rock wall, knees drawn up, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. She looked uninjured, but deeply shaken, as if she'd seen something that had shattered her understanding of the world. "Ashley, I'm Richard, Park Service. Are you hurt?" She shook her head but didn't speak. "How long have you been up here?" "Since..." Ashley's voice was a whisper. "Since yesterday evening. I was taking photos of the sunset and I heard singing. Beautiful singing. I followed it and then..." She gestured helplessly at the ledge around her. "Then what?" "I was down there where you are now. Suddenly I was up here. I don't remember climbing, I just was here." Richard felt his skeptical worldview wobble. "That's not possible." "The Guardian brought me here," Ashley said simply, "to keep me safe. There are things in these woods that aren't natural. She's been protecting me from them all night." As if summoned by her words, the shadows below began moving more aggressively. Richard looked down and saw shapes that definitely weren't cast by trees or rocks. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift and blur when he tried to focus on them. "What are those?" he whispered. "The hungry ones," Ashley replied. "They've been trying to reach me since dark, but she won't let them." She nodded toward the carved guardian above them. Richard's rational mind supplied explanations: altitude sickness, dehydration, mass hysteria. But his eyes told him a different story. The shadows were climbing now, flowing up the rock face like liquid darkness. "We need to get down," he said, trying to keep panic from his voice. "Now." "She won't let us leave," Ashley said. "Not yet. There's something she wants to show us first." The Guardian's carved eyes suddenly blazed with soft golden light. The vision hit Richard like a physical blow, images flooding his mind of the forest as it had been centuries ago. Native families camping in the valley below, children playing by a stream that had long since dried up. Warriors hunting in the forest, always careful to take only what was needed. Then came the violence. Soldiers in blue uniforms, settlers with axes and fire, sacred sites bulldozed for logging roads. The Guardian's people driven away or killed, their memorial sites forgotten and overgrown. But the Guardian remained, bound to this place by grief and duty, protecting it from those who would exploit or destroy it further. The vision faded, leaving Richard gasping. "She wants us to remember," Ashley said softly. "To make sure others remember too." The shadows below had retreated to the forest edge, held at bay by the Guardian's presence. Richard understood now why the area was restricted, why his radio had died, why his equipment failed. The Guardian didn't want the outside world to forget this place existed, but neither would she allow it to be turned into another tourist attraction. "I'll remember," he promised aloud. "I'll make sure the memorials are properly marked and protected." The golden light in the Guardian's eyes pulsed once, then faded. Suddenly, Richard found himself standing on solid ground next to Ashley, both of them safely at the base of the outcropping. His climbing gear lay neatly coiled beside them, though he had no memory of rappelling down. Ashley looked as confused as he felt. How did we? Richard's radio crackled back to life. Unit 7, this is Kowalski. I'm at your last known position. What's your status? We're both fine, Richard replied, helping Ashley to her feet. Subject is uninjured and ready for escort out. As they gathered Ashley's equipment and prepared to leave, Richard noticed the wind chimes had gone silent. The shadows in the forest seemed normal again, cast by ordinary trees and rocks. But when he looked back at the Guardian's carved face, he could have sworn she was smiling. The hike out passed uneventfully. Ashley remained quiet, lost in her own thoughts about the experience. Richard found himself mentally composing the report he'd never be able to write, at least not the truthful version. At the parking area, Ashley paused before getting into the rescue vehicle. You felt it too, she said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded. I did. Will you really make sure the site is protected? I'll do what I can, he promised. 3 months later, Richard stood before the park superintendent with a proposal for enhanced protection and proper historical markers for the Kaweah Memorial area. He'd spent weeks researching the tribal history, consulting with local Native American leaders, and developing a management plan that balanced preservation with limited educational access. The proposal was approved unanimously. On the day the new interpretive signs were installed, Richard hiked alone to the restricted area. The wind chimes still hung from the trees, but they sang a gentler melody now. The Guardian's carved expression seemed peaceful, satisfied. As he prepared to leave, a raven with pale blue eyes landed on a nearby branch and cawed once, a sound like distant gratitude. Richard tipped his ranger hat to both the bird and the carved figure above. Thank you, he whispered to the Guardian, for teaching me what this job really means. The forest around him hummed with quiet approval as he walked back toward the world of radio calls and incident reports, carrying the memory of sacred ground that would never be forgotten again. Daniel Martinez adjusted his radio on his belt as the October wind cut through the pine needles above. 23 years patrolling these mountains, and his gut had never lied to him. Today it was screaming. Base, this is Ranger Martinez, Sector 7 clear, he spoke into his radio, but his eyes stayed locked on the group of locals gathered around their pickup trucks near Whispering Creek Trail. Something's wrong with them, his mind whispered. Real wrong. The group looked normal enough. 5 adults in flannel and worn jeans laughing at something one of them said. But Daniel's skin was crawling like fire ants were marching up his spine. His grandfather used to call it La Vista, the sight. Daniel just called it his gut. And right now it was telling him these folks weren't just here for a Sunday hike. Jennifer, you sure you want to go with them? Daniel turned toward the voice. A young woman with auburn hair, maybe 25, was hugging goodbye to what looked like her boyfriend near a Honda Civic. It's just a day hike, Mark. These people know all the hidden waterfalls. Jennifer's smile was bright, trusting. Mrs. Crenshaw invited me personally after I helped her with groceries yesterday. Mrs. Crenshaw. Daniel knew that name. Lived up on Sourwood Ridge with her extended family. Been here longer than most of the trees. The tingling in Daniel's spine turned to ice. Something was pulling Jennifer toward that group like a fish on a line, and she couldn't feel it. But Daniel could. The sensation was thick as molasses, dark as creek water after a storm. Hey, Daniel called out, walking toward them. His hand instinctively checked his sidearm. Morning, folks. Beautiful day for hiking. Mrs. Crenshaw, a weathered woman with silver hair and eyes like flint, smiled at Daniel, but the smile never reached those eyes. Morning, Ranger Martinez, just showing this sweet girl some of our family's favorite spots. Her voice had that particular mountain lilt, generations deep. Been coming to these places since before your daddy was born. The way she said it made Daniel's teeth ache. Before your daddy was born. Like a threat wrapped in hospitality. Jennifer laughed, shouldering her bright blue backpack. Mark thinks I'm crazy for hiking with strangers, but you all feel like family already. No, Daniel's mind screamed, "Don't go with them." But he couldn't say that. Couldn't explain why his ranger instincts were firing like 4th of July fireworks. These were locals, pillars of the community. He'd be laughed out of the station. "Which trail you folks taking?" Daniel asked, trying to sound casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Old Chapman's Path," said one of the men, broad-shouldered with a graying beard. "Heads up toward Devil's Backbone Ridge." Daniel's blood went cold. Devil's Backbone Ridge hadn't been on any official trail map since the 1970s. Too many accidents. Too many people who went up there and came back different, or didn't come back at all. "That's pretty rough terrain," Daniel said carefully. "Especially this time of year. Trail markers aren't maintained up there." "Oh, we don't need no markers," Mrs. Crenshaw said with that empty smile. "We know the way by heart. By blood, you might say." The air around Daniel began to thicken, like pressure before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. Jennifer hugged Mark one more time. "I'll text you when I get back tonight, okay?" "Be careful," Mark whispered, but he was looking at Daniel with worried eyes, as if he felt it too. The wrongness hanging in the air like smoke from a fire you can't see. Daniel watched helplessly as Jennifer climbed into the bed of the pickup truck with 3 of the locals. Mrs. Crenshaw and the bearded man got in the cab. The engine coughed to life and they pulled away down the Forest Service road, heading deeper into the mountains. "She'll be fine," Mark said, but his voice shook. "Right, Ranger?" Daniel stared at the dust cloud settling behind the truck, his gut churning like a washing machine full of rocks. Every instinct he'd ever trusted was screaming that he'd just watched Jennifer walk into the mouth of something hungry. "Yeah," he lied. "I'm sure she'll be fine." But as the truck disappeared around a bend in the road, Daniel heard something that made his blood freeze. Singing. Faint and distant but unmistakably human voices raised in harmony. Old voices, singing words in a language that predated English in these mountains. And underneath the singing, something else. Something that might have been laughter, or might have been screaming. Daniel grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Martinez. I need you to run a check on..." He paused, realizing he didn't even know Jennifer's last name. "I need you to run a check on the Crenshaw family up on Sourwood Ridge. Everything you can find. Historical records, property deeds, everything." "Copy that, Martinez." "Any particular reason?" Daniel looked up at Devil's Backbone Ridge, where the first shadows of evening were already gathering, despite the afternoon sun. "Just a feeling," he said. "A real bad feeling." His radio crackled back. "Martinez, preliminary check shows the Crenshaw property has been in the family since 1847. No outstanding warrants, no recent complaints. Clean record." Too clean, Daniel thought. Nobody's that clean after 5 generations in these mountains. As darkness began to creep down from the ridgelines like spilled ink, Daniel made a decision that would either save a life or cost him his badge. Maybe both. He was going up Devil's Backbone Ridge, and God help him, he was going alone. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Daniel's situation? Drop a comment below. The engine of Daniel's patrol truck coughed as he navigated the narrow, overgrown logging road that wound up toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. His headlights carved a weak tunnel through the gathering darkness, and every shadow seemed to twist and writhe at the edge of his vision. Mile after mile, the road grew narrower, rougher. Branches scraped against his windows like skeletal fingers. And somewhere in the distance, growing stronger with each turn, came the sound of that singing. Ancient words, ancient melodies, ancient hungers that had been sleeping in these mountains for longer than anyone dared remember. Daniel's radio crackled with static. "Martinez, what's your 20? You're breaking up." He reached for the radio, but his hand stopped halfway. Because there, in the red glow of his taillights, he could see fresh tire tracks in the mud. Tracks that matched the pickup truck that had taken Jennifer. And beside those tracks, carved deep into the soft earth, were symbols that definitely weren't Cherokee. Symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark rhythm. symbols that made Daniel's sixth sense scream so loud he could barely think. Whatever was waiting for him up on Devil's Backbone Ridge, it had been waiting for a very long time, and Jennifer was already there. Holy hell, that was intense. Did this ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying Forest Ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what's really happening to Jennifer. I read every single one. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., jolting Richard Blackwood from his morning coffee. Static filled the cramped ranger station before dispatch broke through. Unit 7, we've got a missing hiker. Jennifer Morrison, age 28, failed to return from the Whispering Pines Trail yesterday evening. Family's been calling all night. Richard set down his mug, already mentally cataloging search protocols. While his colleagues relied on gut instinct and brute force searches, he preferred systematic grid patterns and statistical analysis of lost hiker behavior. It's why they called him Professor behind his back. Not always kindly. Copy that, dispatch. Last known position? Trailhead parking lot shows her Honda Civic still there. Hiking permit shows she planned a day hike to Eagle's Nest Overlook. Should have been back by sundown. Richard grabbed his tactical pack, checking equipment with practiced efficiency. GPS unit, emergency beacon, first aid kit, rope, headlamp, backup batteries. His weathered hands moved automatically while his mind processed variables. Temperature drop overnight, injury probability, wildlife encounters. The October morning bit sharp and clean as he drove the winding Forest Service road. Frost clung to windshields of vehicles at the Whispering Pines trailhead. Jennifer's blue Civic sat alone, morning dew beating on metal. Inside her unlocked car, Richard found a leather purse, phone charger, and a half-eaten energy bar. No cell phone. His trained eye noted details others would miss. Seat adjusted for someone 5.6, classical music preset, photo tucked in the visor showing Jennifer with an elderly woman, probably her grandmother. The trail stretched ahead, familiar yet somehow different this morning. Richard had hiked these paths hundreds of times, but something felt off. The usual morning bird calls seemed muted. Even the wind moved strangely through the pine needles. He activated his GPS, marking Jennifer's car as waypoint 0, and began following the well-worn path. Boot prints in the soft earth, size 7 women's hiking boots, consistent with Jennifer's permit information. The impression showed a normal gait, no signs of hurry or panic. 2 miles in, the trail forked, left to Eagle's Nest, right toward the abandoned logging camp. Jennifer's track stayed left, following her planned route. Richard radioed his position to dispatch, noting grid coordinates and weather conditions. Temperatures dropping faster than forecast, he reported. Visibility good, but there's an unusual fog building in the lower elevations. That fog bothered him. The meteorological conditions didn't support fog formation. Barometric pressure was high, humidity low, yet tendrils of gray mist clung to the forest floor like searching fingers. At mile marker 4, Jennifer's trail disappeared. Richard crouched, studying the ground with methodical precision. Her boot prints simply stopped. No signs of struggle, no other footprints, no broken vegetation indicating she'd left the path. Just empty earth where tracks should continue. His analytical mind rejected the impossibility. People didn't vanish. There had to be logical explanation. Rock outcropping disguising tracks, perhaps, or animals disturbing the sign. He widened his search pattern, circling outward in systematic spirals. Nothing. It was as if Jennifer had simply stepped out of existence at this exact spot. The fog thickened. Richard pulled out his cell phone to call for backup, but found no signal. Strange. He'd had 3 bars just moments ago. The GPS unit flickered, coordinates shifting randomly before stabilizing. A sound drifted through the mist. Faint, musical, singing. He froze, listening intently. The melody came from deeper in the forest, off-trail. Beautiful, but somehow wrong. The voice was clear, crystalline, and definitely female. "Jennifer?" he called out. "Jennifer Morrison?" The singing stopped abruptly. Richard clicked on his radio. Static. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. Nothing but white noise. Following standard protocol, he activated his emergency beacon and continued toward where he'd heard the voice. His boots crunched through frost-stiff leaves as he pushed through undergrowth, marking his path with biodegradable trail markers. The singing resumed, fainter now, leading him deeper into the forest. His breath came in visible puffs despite the morning having been warm. The temperature was dropping rapidly, unnaturally so. Richard checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. He'd been on Jennifer's trail for 2 hours. Through the thickening mist, shapes began to emerge. Not trees, structures. Old weathered wooden buildings partially collapsed and overgrown with decades of vegetation. The abandoned logging camp. Richard's pulse quickened. Local history placed this camp's closure in 1962 after a series of accidents and disappearances. Superstitious locals claimed it was cursed, but Richard had always dismissed such talk as rural folklore. Now surrounded by the skeletal remains of bunkhouses and equipment sheds, he felt less certain. The singing came from the largest building, the old mess hall. Its sagging roof and broken windows gave it the appearance of a skull, dark openings like empty eye sockets staring at him through the fog. "Jennifer," he called again, louder this time. Movement in his peripheral vision made him spin around. A figure stood between the trees, pale, translucent, watching him with hollow eyes. Richard blinked hard, and it was gone. If this story is giving you chills, hit that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Richard's situation? Comment below. His hands trembled as he reached for his service weapon. Not that bullets would help against hallucinations brought on by stress and low blood sugar. He forced himself to think logically. 12 hours of searching, minimal food, high stress. His mind was playing tricks. The singing started again, definitely coming from inside the mess hall. Richard approached carefully, noting details with forced professional calm. The building's foundation was intact, but the wooden walls showed extensive rot. Safety hazard. He should call for structural engineers before entering. But Jennifer might be inside. Injured, hypothermic, calling for help in delirium. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. Richard pushed it open slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through dusty air thick with decades of abandonment. Tables and chairs lay scattered across the floor, covered in pine needles and animal droppings. Graffiti from years of teenage trespassers decorated the walls. But in the center of the room, something made Richard's analytical mind stutter. Fresh boot prints. Size 7 women's hiking boots. Jennifer's tracks led across the room to a wooden staircase, stairs that couldn't possibly support human weight, yet showed no signs of collapse. The singing came from upstairs. Richard tested the first step carefully. The wood held. He climbed slowly, flashlight beam dancing across water-stained walls covered in old photographs, logging crews, company picnics, Christmas parties. Faces from decades past stared down at him with sepia-toned eyes. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway stretched toward a single open door. Light spilled through the opening. Not electric light, but something softer, more organic. The singing was clearer now, multiple voices harmonizing in a language he didn't recognize. Richard reached the doorway and looked inside. Jennifer sat in the center of the room, cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, lips moving silently. She appeared unharmed, but somehow distant. Translucent figures surrounded her, men and women in work clothes from different eras, their faces bearing the marks of violent death, crushed skulls, severed limbs, burnt flesh. They were the logging camp's victims, workers killed in accidents that were anything but accidental, workers who discovered something in these woods that shouldn't have been found. As Richard watched, frozen between terror and duty, the figures turned toward him, their mouths opened in unison, releasing a sound like wind through broken glass. Jennifer's eyes snapped open, but they weren't her eyes anymore. "She's one of us now," Jennifer's voice said, though her lips didn't move. "Like you'll be soon." The spectral figures began moving toward him, and Richard understood with crystal clarity that his intelligence, his training, his rational worldview meant nothing here. This was older than logic, deeper than science. He ran. Behind him, the building groaned and shifted, as if the very structure was pursuing him. Richard crashed through the doorway, down the stairs, his analytical mind completely overthrown by primal terror. The fog outside had become a living thing, reaching for him with tendrils that felt like icy fingers. His radio crackled to life, not with dispatch but with voices from decades past. "Can't find the way out. Something's wrong with this place. Help us, please." Richard stumbled through the forest, no longer following any search pattern, just running. His GPS spun wildly, showing locations that didn't exist on any map. His compass pointed in impossible directions. The singing followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He burst from the tree line into harsh daylight, gasping and disoriented. The parking lot lay ahead, but Jennifer's blue Civic was gone. In its place sat a rusted sedan with license plates from 1987. Richard checked his watch. The display showed 5:47 a.m. He was back where he started, but when he started had changed. His radio crackled. Static filled the air before dispatch broke through. "Unit 7, we've got a missing hiker. Jennifer Morrison, age 28, failed to return from the Whispering Pines Trail yesterday evening. Family's been calling all night." But now Richard understood. Jennifer Morrison had disappeared in 1987. He was trapped in the echo of her disappearance, doomed to search for her forever while the spirits of the logging camp slowly added him to their collection. His cell phone buzzed. A text from his wife. "Love you. Be careful out there." Richard looked at the photo in his wallet. His daughter's smiling face, his wife's gentle eyes. Family was his anchor to the living world. If the spirits fed on isolation and despair, then love might be his only weapon. He keyed his radio with steady hands. "Dispatch, Unit 7. I've found evidence of supernatural activity at the old logging camp, requesting immediate backup and maybe a priest." The response was static, but underneath it, he heard something else. Jennifer Morrison's voice, calling his name from deep in the forest. This time he didn't run. He walked deliberately toward the sound, armed with nothing but love for his family and the knowledge that some searches are worth dying for. The fog parted before him like a curtain, revealing a path he'd never seen before, a path that led not deeper into the forest, but toward a light that had nothing to do with sun or moon. Behind him, the spectral figures watched from the tree line, no longer pursuing. They understood. Love was the one force they couldn't corrupt, the one trail they couldn't redirect. Richard followed the light home, leaving Jennifer Morrison to find her own way at last. But on foggy October mornings, hikers on the Whispering Pines Trail still report hearing voices singing in languages that predate human settlement. And sometimes, just sometimes, they glimpse a forest ranger with kind eyes walking the boundary between the living and the dead, making sure no one else gets lost forever. Damn, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying forest ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Jennifer Morrison. I read every single one. What would you have done in Richard's situation? Would you have trusted love over logic? Let me know below.